All right, welcome back. Now we are going to touch on stimulus control, so the antecedents of the antecedent behavior consequence relationship. So the learning objectives for this section, we're going to explain generalization and discrimination processes of stimulus control, including but not limited to generalization gradients, peak shift, gradient narrowing, and overtraining effects. So we'll talk about each of these. Then identify the importance of context and how context becomes a relevant discriminative stimulus of behavior. And then from there, we will talk about a series of different studies looking at the effects of stimulus control of different odor properties for detection dogs. So hopefully this is a bit of a repeat of things that we've been talking about already. So the concept of a discriminative stimulus or the antecedent is, say, for example, we have a rat that is trained to press a lever in the presence of a light. And if the light is off, then lever pressing is not reinforced. So that you have a stimulus that becomes a discriminative stimulus that indicates the availability of reinforcer if they were to press on the lever. And we can have an S delta or an extinction stimulus that indicates that if the light is off, lever presses will not be reinforced. So then discrimination and or stimulus control is basically that the rat will start to show a differentiation in response, such that when the light is on, they press the lever. When the light is off, they don't press the lever. This is then stimulus control, indicating that their behavior is controlled by the stimulus presence, by the stimulus presence, in this case being the light. So stimulus control refers to the change in behavior that occurs when either an SD or an S delta is presented. Control of behavior by antecedent events. So these are going to be the things that come before behavior. Remember that with operant behavior, antecedent stimuli do not elicit behavior. It's not a reflexive relationship. So to some degree, control is probably an inappropriate word here. I'm using it more from a historical context because it's not like the stimulus are eliciting these kinds of behavior. Rather, they are just setting the occasion for these behavior and are just indicating the availability or non-availability of reinforcers, not like the stimuli are kind of like pulling out said behavior from the individual. But nonetheless, this is how we have behavioral probabilities increase or decrease based off of the antecedent events related to them. So going back to our three-term contingency, the antecedent behavior consequence, the contingency being the relationship between these. Now that we're talking about stimulus control, we are really referring into that antecedent section of behavior. In our last section of schedules of reinforcement, we were talking about the consequences of the behaviors and how that impacted rates of behavior between our different schedules of reinforcement. Now we'll be looking at the antecedents, or the things that come before. We've already been talking about some, but we'll get into more details on that now. So discrimination is behaving differently in the presence of different stimuli. So when an organism makes a differential response to two or more stimuli, we can say that the animal discriminates between them and that process is discrimination. For our odor detection canines, right? So just thinking about, say, a backpack with C4 in it versus a backpack without C4 in it. If they respond to the backpack with C4 and do not respond to the backpack without C4, then we could say that the animal is discriminating, or there's a discrimination in responses between the backpack with the C4 versus the backpack without the C4, so that there is a differential behavior between those two different kinds of stimuli. Discrimination is an important sort of adaptive behavior and survival. So indicating which are going to be the flowers to get pollen from versus the ones that are not to get pollen from, which are going to be the odors that are going to be reinforced versus which are the odors that will not be reinforced. So our discriminative stimuli are going to be the ones that indicates that making an alert response in the presence of that odor will be reinforced, and our S deltas are going to be the stimuli that are non-targets, that in responses to the non-targets will not be reinforced. And we can have subtle discriminations that animals can do by, for example, differentiating between these two types of butterflies, where one is going to be an important edible food and the other one is going to be toxic. We spend a lot of time making very subtle discriminations between safe versus non-safe things. And part of our odor detection work is identifying what are going to be our targets that we want, or potential explosives as our SDs, or narcotics as our SDs, or whatever that discipline happens to be. Whereas our else deltas are going to basically be almost pretty much anything else in the world, right? Any other kind of odor that is not going to fall within our SD land or discriminative stimuli. So conceptually sounds really quite easy, but in practice, and particularly when it comes to odors, it's actually really quite complicated, particularly when we have a wide range of things that we want to be our SDs and our wide range of things that we want to be S deltas. Trying to make separation between these types of things while also getting a very good range of SDs can be quite challenging. And we'll talk about some of those difficulties as we get on. Training discriminations, relatively straightforward. It's going to go back to similar to our shaping, is that we're going to engage in differential reinforcement, meaning that we're going to reinforce behaviors to some things, but not to other things. So in this case, we're going to differentially reinforce responses to one stimulus, but not to another stimulus, such that we'll be shaping responses to our target stimulus, and we'll be putting any responses to our non-target stimulus under extinction, so that eventually there will be discrimination in responding between the two stimuli. The level of sort of complexity that can come about from our discrimination training can actually be quite extensive. So we'll talk about some simple examples, just to give you a sense of what are some of the more complex situations, is that animals can actually learn very complex discriminations, almost to the point of, we can say, is they can develop complex concepts of target stimuli and non-target stimuli. And in this case, potentially even abstract concepts. So just as one example of it, pigeons have been trained to be capable of adequately categorizing very complex concepts, such as things like trees versus man-made objects versus non-man-made objects. And this is an example that's just kind of interesting, where pigeons were trained to develop a concept of artistic style, basically. So the pigeons were discriminating between Picasso paintings versus Monet paintings, where the pigeons would learn and were able to correctly sort of categorize whether a picture looked something more like a Picasso or whether something looked more like a Monet, and that they were actually able to generalize to different sort of artistic styles, where styles that were similar to a Monet were actually categorized as being Monet-like, and styles that were more similar to a Picasso style were considered to be more like a Picasso. Even though they had never seen these different types of artist renditions, they were able to successfully generalize and categorize based off of something as abstract as artistic style. So animals can learn very complex kinds of discriminations and what we'd say complex categories under stimulus control, or even concepts, if you will. So our explosives detection dogs essentially need to learn a kind of concept of what is a range of explosives versus a range of non-explosives. But when it comes to odors, that's actually a bit more complicated, because it's not like there is a common odor stream between explosives and non-explosives. In fact, there can be a lot of overlap between explosives and non-explosives, as well as there can be very little overlap or very little similarity between one type of explosive and another type of explosive. So when it comes to the odor world, these kinds of things are really quite complicated. But nonetheless, the foundations are there to indicate that our animals are capable of doing very complex, almost concept formation style categorizations by being able to group similar items as stimuli that they would generalize to, and being able to differentiate that from different categories of stimuli in which they are able to discriminate between this sort of Monet style paintings versus Picasso style paintings, but then generalize within a category between all of the Monet styles and all of the Picasso styles. So again, generalization is going to be sort of responding similarly to a range of stimuli that follow or have some type of similar dimension component to them. So we can look at very simple single dimensions. So for example, color based off of wavelength of light, or more complex types of stimuli that vary on a variety of dimensions, like different kinds of boats, pictures of boats, drawings of boats, the word boat. These will all be situations in which we generalize within a type of category of complex stimuli. How do we study sort of generalization, particularly when we have a more simple stimulus that might vary on a single dimension? So we can use things like a generalization gradient to study how responding varies within a singular dimension of a particular kind of stimulus. So a generalization gradient is a function that relates values of an SD, a discriminative stimulus, to measures of response strength. And examples of sort of SD values that we can vary along a single dimension are going to be wavelengths of light, brightness of light, loudness, pitch of tone, all of these kinds of things. Notice, however, for our detection canines, though, I don't really have anything in here about odor type or odor similarity. And the reason for that is that only under a very handful of circumstances does it seem that we have a singular dimension in which odors can be related to each other. So on top of the behavioral complexity of training things, odors also add their own layer of complexity, which needs their own essentially separate class to discuss the relationship between different kinds of odors. But nonetheless, the quick answer here is that with the exception of a couple of cases that we'll cover, most odors, the variability between them is not just a singular dimension, which means that it's very difficult to generate these kinds of generalization gradients based off of them. But how would you do this with a single stimulus or a simple dimension? So we can use wavelength of light, which basically refers to color. So each color is just a different wavelength of light. And we can reinforce responses in the presence of a single stimulus, or this kind of orange color key here. So we can train an animal to respond to an orange color key. Every time you see an orange color key, peck at that. And then we can measure responses to a variety of stimuli under extinction. So we could look at the orange stimulus, the yellow, red, green, purple, and different kinds of purple. This can be similar. We can do similar kinds of tests for our detection dogs, where we could train to one odor, or say one variety of, say, C4, one variety of a particular kind of narcotic, and then see, do they spontaneously respond to different variations of that? So maybe a source of explosive from a different manufacturer, or source of narcotics from a different distributor, or a source of narcotics from a different location. Do they respond to all of them spontaneously, or do they not? And we test them under extinction, most importantly, because if we start reinforcing any of these other individual varieties, then we'll get responses because we just trained them to start responding to those individual varieties. So we test them under extinction, where if they do respond to them, we don't provide a reinforcer so that we're not explicitly training them to each of these individual stimuli. We're assessing, if you learned this one, do you spontaneously, without me training you to do it, respond to these other varieties? So in a simple pigeon experiment, you can have an orange stimulus, and then if the orange stimulus is present, the animal's trained to peck it, and then present a variety of other stimuli without reinforcement, and see to what degree do they respond to all of these different variations. And then once you've constructed this gradient, you can plot on your x-axis your variations in wavelength of light. So this is just an arbitrary dimensions here, but we can present wavelengths of light in a very linear relationship, right? So you can have 550 nanometers, 560 nanometers, 570 nanometers, 580 nanometers. This could be pitch in terms of frequency, right? So this could be a boo, and this would be a higher pitch beep versus a lower pitch boo kind of tone. And we can look at, if you train them to one particular tone, boo, how do they respond to a beep, to a boo, to different variations of that tone. And you can have different levels of generalization based off of different reinforcement and training histories. So we can have what would be called a flat gradient, which would be something in which you have a similar level of responding to a wide variety of stimuli. So the range from boop to boop well, sorry, try that again. Boop, boop, kind of things. You can have relatively high responses to all of these, whereas going to lower generalizations from boo, 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 you still have relatively high levels of responding. You can have essentially the opposite, where you have high levels of responding to one stimulus, and then it becomes very, very narrow, where in all of these other ranges, you have very few responses to them. So you can have what we call a steep gradient, which goes really, really steep. You respond to that specific stimulus that you were trained to find, or that specific stimulus that you were trained on, but then you respond to almost no variations within that stimulus. Or you can have a flat generalization gradient, where you basically respond to a wide range of stimuli around what it was that you were trained to. And based off of reinforcement histories and different kinds of experiences can help indicate whether you're going to have a steep generalization gradient or a flat generalization gradient. So one or a couple of these examples are steep generalization gradients tend to occur when you have more discrimination. So the more different the range of stimuli are along your x-axis can lead to a more steep generalization gradient. And also things like what we call overtraining. So overtraining might be a situation in which, say, instead of training to that one orange stimulus for one day and then testing the pigeons, I trained this pigeon to that one specific orange stimulus for the next 2 years. Every day for 2 years, they have that very precise orange stimulus. That would be a situation which we might expect overtraining, where you get extremely strong responses to that very precise stimulus, but then to nothing or no variations around that. They've become hyper stimulus control focused to that one particular stimulus because that's all that they've been trained with for a long period of time. Then you can get very strong or very steep generalization gradients to that very, very particular stimulus. Flat generalization gradient, which is going to be a bit more flatter, that would be simple situations, and you can generate that by simply not just training to this one S plus, but I can explicitly produce a very flat gradient by then training to this stimulus, training to this stimulus, training to this stimulus, training to this stimulus, training to that stimulus. So if I had an example for detection dogs, perhaps different sources of a particular target of C4, for example, not just training to the one source, but training to variations of the different sources of that one particular material would produce a flatter and broader kind of generalization gradient than having just a singular example of that, which might produce a particularly narrow one, especially if the animal is trained with that one stimulus for a long period of time, would be an example of overtraining. Additionally, motivation operations can increase generalization. So if you're particularly motivated, so based off of if you've been deprived of food, or perhaps you're super motivated for that toy, then you tend to produce a more flat generalization gradient because you're really looking for that reinforcer. So if it's somewhat close, why not roll the dice and give it a gamble? If you're a bit more satiated, not as motivated, then if that's not your target and it's not the precise target that you've been trained on, then it may not be worth your effort to make a response to that stimulus. So in this case, the motivating operations tend to produce broader generalization gradients or flatter generalization gradients. In addition, experience tends to produce steeper generalization gradients. So having that specific repeated experience with one particular type of target can produce that steeper gradient, leading to very high levels of responding to that one specific stimulus that you've been training on, but very few responses to any variations thereof. In addition, stimulus control tends to be relatively what we say, or stimulus control tends to be what we say is relative, meaning that experience with different kinds of S minuses can have can change the shape of that or can change where your generalization gradient sort of lies based off of experience of different kinds of extinction stimuli, leading to examples of peak shift, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. But nonetheless, having the number of experiences to different S pluses or different SDs or S delta or S discriminative stimuli And experiences with different S deltas or S minuses or extinction stimuli have important effects on those generalization gradients. So while I'm here already, as I said, having multiple trained S pluses can make you a much broader generalization gradient across a variety of stimuli, but also training with an S delta or an S minus, a negative stimuli, will have very important effects by moving responding away from that extinction stimulus and having a complete change in where the peak is of that sort of target responding. So experience with different types of gradient or different types of S pluses, the amount of experience you have with your target, and different kinds of experiences with extinction stimuli are all important, as well as motivating operations and the amount and kinds of generalization that you can expect. With that, let's go an example of how we can do a generalization gradient with dogs and odors for double-base smokeless powder.